welcome to Vulgar. And we're doing radical engagements. And today I'm covering John Bellamy Foster's New Irrationalism, which I believe is a plea for the relevance of the destruction of reason by Lukács, which is often derided as a Stalinist Lukácsian text. I actually find it a very mixed text. I'm not as sanguine on it as some people, but I think for a huge book, let me just grab it. I have it back here. I should probably cover some of these essays eventually. There are some great essays in here, and there are some essays I don't love. And that would make sense because it's a 600-page book covering a large part of the middle, I believe, of Lukács' career. This was originally published in 1952, but kind of ignored for a long time. Anyway, let's get back to John Bellamy Foster, former guest of the show. Discussion of this. The New Irrationalism by John Bellamy Foster. More than a century after the commencement of the Great Crisis of 1914 to 1945, what we can call the interwar period, represented by the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, they did choose barbarism, as I like to call it. We are seeing a certain resurgence of war and fascism across the globe. I think we've been seeing it since about 2006. Personally, while there's been a lot made about left populism and its failures, right populism has had a worldwide appeal and has been more successful at gaining power, although less successful or as successful, let's say, as left populism in actually bucking international trends. Maloney's government and Trump's government largely still fall in line of the right-wing politics of their country, despite the populist gloss. Anyway, the capitalist world economy as a whole is now characterized by deepening stagnation, financialization, and soaring inequity. Yeah, and short-term financialization at that. All of this is accompanied by the prospect of planetary omnicide and the dual forms of nuclear holocaust and climate destabilization. I would add environmental destabilization in general, not just from the climate. I think it's good that we focus on the most obvious and potentially destabilizing form, but I think we often forget that the environmental degradation and mass extinctions are not totally related to climate change, but other environmental degradations play into it as well. This is not anything John Bellamy Foster would disagree with. I just think we should always keep that in mind. Anyway, back to the text. In this dangerous context, the very notion of human reason is frequently called into question all the time. Has been since the 70s. Has been since the advent of Heideggerianism. It is therefore necessary to address once and again the question of the relations of imperialism, or monopoly capitalism, to the destruction of reason, and the ramifications of this for contemporary and anti-imperialist, contemporary class and anti-imperialist struggles. I have found that monopoly capitalism in the pages of the monthly review shifts its definition quite often. Sometimes it means what Bukharin and Lenin meant by it. Sometimes it means what Baran and Sweezy meant by it. And those are not the same things, but given Baran and Sweezy's role in the founding of the monthly review, I would be hard-pressed to expect John Bellamy Foster to take a strong anti-Sweezyite line in favor of a more purist Lenin one. He would probably argue that they are the same thing, but I just think that if you read what Bukharin and Lenin are talking about versus what Baran and Sweezy are talking about, there's clearly some pretty big differences. All right. In 1953, Georges Lukács, whose 1923 History and Class Consciousness had inspired the Western Marxist philosophical tradition, asterisk, according to Perry Anderson, asterisk, and then as rebutted by Dominica Lacerdo, we kind of coming up with a counter historiography around the same group of writers, although selectively, and including a lot of non-Marxists in the Western Marxist tradition, like Foucault. I think that we too much work is done on this idea. I mean, after all, the structuralist and the humanist Marxist are diametrically opposed to each other, and they have different readings of what was going on in the Soviet Union, but they're both Western Marxism. All right, quote. Lukács' work set off a firestorm amongst Western left theorists seeking to accommodate themselves to a new American imperium. In 1963, George Lichtheim, a self-taught socialist operating within the general tradition of Western Marxism, again, what general tradition of Western Marxism? Lichtheim didn't even consider himself a Marxist. I have his book over there. He says it in the book. I expect better historiography than this, frankly. While virulently opposed to Soviet Marxism, yes, he was, as were many of the social democrats of the era, but many of them didn't even consider themselves Marxists by that point. So talking about them in terms of this generic Western Marxism that pretends that all this is the same and it all emerged out of the new left is not an entirely honest historiography. I know where they're getting it from, and I know why they're doing it, but I don't think it works. All right. There's lots wrong with the anti-communist period of social democracy in America, which Lichtheim and Norman Brown and everybody who probably published with the Congress of Cultural Freedom, and there's a lot wrong with that. But a lot of those people had abandoned Marxism, or like Lichtheim never considered themselves full Marxists in the first place. Anyway, who wrote an article for Encounter magazine, then covertly funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, which he vehemently attacked the destruction of reason and other works by Lukács. Lichtheim accused Lukács of generating an intellectual disaster, and with his analysis of the historical shift from reason to unreason within the European philosophy and literature, and the relation to the rise of this to the rise of fascism and new imperialism under U.S. global hegemony. I will say that where John Bellamy Foster is correct here, not that he cares what I think, but is that there were a bunch of these social democrats and not insignificant number of Trotskyists, to be quite honest, but more social democrats who sided with the Congress for Cultural Freedom and worked with covertly CIA-funded magazines. We don't know how much these people knew they were working for the CIA, but the fact that the CIA would use them in and of itself is something to be concerned about. I see that John Bellamy Foster is leaning on the popular Western Marxist framework, which is just an inversion of the New Left Review version of the same thing, which was an anti-Soviet Marxism promoted amongst the New Left. I don't see how flipping that paradigm, which was a false paradigm in the first place, which even collapses people who moved to the DDR after World War II, like Ernst Bloch, in with the Frankfurt School, in with post-Marxist as all one tradition, including a bunch of social democrats who abandoned Marxism when they were writing. I don't see what that gets you, except a neat way to do to Western quote-unquote Marxism what was done to Eastern Marxism at the time. But why is Baron and Sweezy not considered Western Marxists? They were. They wrote with some of these people. Well, that's because they founded the New Left Review, huh? Anyway. I know my friend Daniel Tutt will be more impressed with this kind of logic, and I like John Bellamy Foster's work in general. Lukács in his late period, his Stalinism is greatly overstated. He actually talks a lot about his ambivalence about that period of his work. And he was right to be ambivalent about the early period of his work too, I think. And I know I am unpopular in certain circles for saying that. I think there are problematic over Hegelian thinking, if there is such a thing, in history and class consciousness that later works like The Destruction of Reason aren't as guilty of. So if you're going to critique this, I think you have to critique it on its arguments, not whether or not it's secretly Stalinist. similar to a Western Marxist. I think it's far more important that we deal with the flaws of what they said than invent some tradition that squeezes all these people in so you can easily discount them and come up with a theodicy for why Soviet Marxism was ill-received in the United States. You know, and there's plenty of reasons, the CIA, the Red Scare, etc., but also the Communist Party of the period didn't really help itself very much, as it was not involved in a lot of the key movements in the 1960s until late. And it started fracturing into other, because the Sino-Soviet split fractured the CPUSA at the time. Like, that's a long delay story, but it's a very clear one. Flushing that under Western Marxism doesn't really get you out of the problem, but it conveniently shuts a lot of people's brain off. This is not the first time, of course, that Lukács has been subjected to such strong condemnations by figures associated with Western Marxism. Adorno, one of the dominant theorists of the Frankfurt School, attacked Lukács in 1958 when the latter was still under house arrest for supporting the 1956 revolution in Hungary, which is one of the things that Ernst Bloch, when he went back to the West, he stayed in the DDR from, I believe, 1946 to what happened in Hungary. So, you know, I think it's pretty important that whatever criticism we might have of Lukács, that we put this into context that he cited with the uprising in Hungary, which was a mixed character uprising, I might say. There were reactionary elements to it. There were even fascistic elements to it. There were also left-wing elements to it. This flattening out of history that you commonly see in partisan writing isn't helpful. And I'm going to give John Bellamy Foster credit, as much as I'm annoyed by this historiographic construct of Western Marxism, itself a construct that was only invented to delegitimize Soviet and Sino-Marxism, all right? I don't think inverting it really helps. I don't think inverting a bad paradigm makes a paradigm better. This is a criticism I have of the Lacerto book. I actually agree with David Broder about some of Lacerto's claims. For example, he cites non-Marxist or Ernst Bloch before he was a Marxist as proofs of his Western Marxist deviations without dealing with what he said later. And it's not even figured in. And also the figures covered in some ways seem covered because they're easy to do this to, whereas other figures are harder to talk about, but were definitely part of Western Marxism, like Althusser. Are Grossman. Anyway, back to this. I didn't know we were going to get bogged down in this framework. Writing in Der Mann, a journal created by the occupying U.S. Army and funded by the CIA, Adorno charges Lukács with reductive and undialectical writing like a cultural commissar, and with being paralyzed from the onset by the consciousness of his own impotence. Well, I mean, Adorno and Lukács insulting each other is hardly a new thing. After all, what did Lukács accuse the Frankfurt School of being by the 1950s Hotel Grand Abyss? However, the 1963 attack on Lukács by Liechtenstein and Encounter took an added significance due to the absolute condemnation of Lukács' destruction of reason. Yeah, I'm going to say I like Liechtenstein's history of American socialism, but I don't trust his opinions on this kind of stuff. I do think we need to be honest about Liechtenstein's function here. It's very similar to Norman Brown or Sidney Hook. People who became pretty anti-communist, or Horkheimer in a late period, for example. In this work, Lukács had charted the relationship of philosophical irrationalism. The first emerged in the European continent, particularly in Germany, with the defeat of the 1848 revolutions. I mean, Lukács is basically doing the Marxist version of the entire career of Isaiah Berlin, but going much further to contemporary history. Okay, and there's some good stuff in this book. All right, I want to second John Bellamy Foster here for all of my critique of this framework. There's some great stuff in this book. There's some stuff I don't like. I think Lukács fundamentally misreads Wittgenstein, for example. But he's dead on about Spengler, he's dead on about Schmidt, he's dead on about Heidegger, he's dead on about Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Bergson. All right. It became a dominant force near the end of the century to the rise of the imperial stage of capitalism. For Lukács, irrationalism, including its ultimate coalescence with Nazism, was no fortuitous development, but rather a product of capitalism itself. We could think of this in Weberian terms, this is me talking, as the end of rationalization, right? Where rationalization turns on itself. And we have to be fair. I mean, it's kind of amazing that Adorno and Horkheimer turned so hard on this book, because their dialectic of enlightenment implies similar things, right? Lichtheim responded by charging Lukács with having committed an intellectual crime and illegitimately drawing a connection between philosophical irrationalism associated with such thinkers as Arthur Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche, Bergson, Sorel, Spengler, Heidegger, and Schmidt, people that postmodernists and post-structuralists, I don't think postmodernism is really a thing, but post-Marxist and post-structuralists tended to really like how much Sorel and Schmidt and Heidegger are in Agamben, for example, and the rise of Adolf Hitler. Lukács productively stated his book by saying, the subject matter which presents itself to us is Germany's path to Hitler in the spirit of philosophy. And like I said, I think some of his readings of like Wittgenstein are wrong, but I think overwhelmingly, Lukács is pretty good here. And I didn't read this book for a long time because I basically accepted the admonition that it was too Stalinist to be taken seriously. Now, I aim to be neither Stalinophilic nor Stalinophobic. All right. Many of the problems I have with the 1930s Soviet Union are Stalin's pivoting in the Comintern. I will maintain. But I also think some of the problems that we lay at the feet of one man is actually problems of an entirely failed revolution, because they wouldn't have happened if Germany's 1918 revolution had not liquidated so poorly. So to blame that on Stalin when he's trying to keep something together, even if he does so in a horrendous manner at times. I mean, the war on the kulaks was basically a civil war. And it was not one that I think was ultimately super necessary. All right. But, and the forces unleashed in the Yuzovchina, even Stalin realized were bad, even if he set up quotas for it. All right. But it's easy to pretend like this is about stash man good or stash man bad, and it really isn't. Right? We need a more, even early Maoists who were diehard anti-revisionist had critiques of Stalin. Although, let's be honest, if they had tried to be more forthright about why the Sino-Soviet split happened, they would have to talk more about what Stalin did. And instead, they tried to pivot around Khrushchev because of the historical nihilism of throwing Stalin under the bus. And I will say this, I think there is something to the idea that Khrushchev was trying to save face by doing what he did. I think Beria, who I see as a bigger monster and a bigger liberalizer from what we know from the plans that I've seen and from historians looked at the archives, would have done the same thing, actually. So, or maybe more so. We have to ask ourselves then, what happened in the Yuzovchina that left it to where Khrushchev and Beria were the best people you were going to produce? And I don't see a lot of people, including MLs, really sitting with that. Although I will give Maoists historically some credit here, they have. Right? They do have thoughts on this. And if people read more than Western Marxist theory, the so-called Western Marxism, they would know a lot more of this stuff. Even liberal historiography, if you read past this anti-communist bias, is usually more direct and factual on it. Read the Kotkin biographies of Stalin, which are not biographies, by the way, that were written by a man who's particularly pro-communist. He's just trying to be a good bourgeois historian. Anyway, this text is long, and I've been on a commentary spree. Let's get back to it. But his critique was, in fact, much broader, seeing irrationalism as related to the imperial stage of capitalism more generally. Hence, what most outraged Lukács's critics in the West in the early 1960s was his suggestion that the problem of the destruction of reasons had not vanished with the historic defeat of fascism. Bing, bing, bing. And he was right, it hadn't. But that it was continuing to nurture reactionary tendencies, if more covertly, in the new Cold War area dominated by U.S. imperialism. And if Lukács had read or lived longer to say more about French post-Marxism, I think he'd have a lot to say. Unfortunately, he died roughly contemporaneously to that time. Dying in 1971 at 86 years old, he really didn't see the full flowering of the new left or of the post-Marxist left, are particularly some of the ways in which post-structuralism was to develop. And on that, Dominique Lacerda actually has some quite smart things to say. For those people who think that I hate Lacerda, that is not correct either. All these figures should not be above critique, and none of them answer all the problems that we have. Even the people documenting the CIA's involvement, which is very much real, sometimes will overstate how much these scholars knew about what they were doing. Anyway, back to this. Hence, what outlines Lukács's Western critics in the 1960s was the suggestion that the problem of destruction of reason was not vanished with the historical feat of fascism, but was continuing to nurture reactionary tendencies, if more covertly, in the new Cold War era dominated by U.S. imperialism. Ferran Cosca's nightmares, Lichting charged, were treated by Lukács as evidence of the diabolical world character of modern capitalism, now represented by the United States. Yet, Lukács's argument in this respect was impossible to refute. It's not possible to refute, just no one did. This is, he wrote, in terms still meaningful today. In contrast to Germany, the US had a constitution which was democratic form to start. Well, to some degree. And its ruling class managed, particularly during the imperialist era, to have the democratic form so effectively preserved by democratically legal means, it achieved a dictatorship of monopoly capitalism, at least as firm as that which Hitler set up with the tyrannical procedures. So I agree with Lukács on this. All right. I think that Fordism and Keynesianism were just as much of a way out of the profitability crises of classical commodity capitalism as fascism was. But they were softer, less violent, at least less violent to their own populations, and thus easier to make excuses for. Anyway, I think Lukács was right about that. The smoothly functioning democracy, so-called, was created by the presidential prerogative, the Supreme Court's authority in constitutional questions, the finance monopoly over the press, radio, etc., electioneering costs, which successfully prevented really democratic parties from springing up besides the two parties of monopoly capitalism. And lastly, the use of terroristic devices, the listing system, particularly the lynching system, particularly in the South, although not just in the South. Democracy could, in substance, realize everything sought by Hitler without needing to break with democracy formally. This was actually a point where Bergson would agree with Lukács, which is an interesting development. I'm not going to go into that here, but it's something to think about. Bergson's critique of democracy to court was based off it always becoming bourgeois democracy and thus problematic. In addition, there was comparatively broader and more solid basis of monopoly capitalism. Now, that is Fordism he's describing right there, and he's right. I think he's absolutely right. And it's funny to me today that a lot of today's left, even a lot of the ML left, what they describe wanting is basically Fordism back. It's something for people to think about. In these circumstances, irrationalism and the piling up of cynical contempt for humanity, think about the observations made by Mark Fisher about capitalist realism's bleakness. Lukács insisted was the necessary ideological consequence of the structure and potential influence of American imperialism. The shocking claim that there was a continuity in the relation of imperialism and irrationalism extending over the course of the entire century, from the late 19th century Europe through fascism and continuing through the new NATO imperium, which dominated the United States, was strongly rejected at the time by those associated with the Western Marxist philosophical tradition. Be specific, John Bellamy Foster. Who rejected it and who didn't? Name names. Don't use a blanket historiographic category to not do that. All right? Name names. Who rejected it, who didn't comment on it, etc. The reason why I say that is the hard time I have squaring what is used here is that there are strong implications in Adorno and Horkheimer that they actually agree with the Lukácsian thesis, but can't agree with it the way Lukács does. So they're defending the NATO imperium as somehow preferable to Soviet expansion, right? But what they say about fascism and Western society is that it was still going on after the defeat of fascism. I mean, basically, that where you get to a minimum royalized, everything is fascist. And what Lukács is basically saying is, no, there might be problems with Soviet Marxism, and Lukács's late writings in the 60s make it clear that he did think there were some, and obviously he had a critique, or he wouldn't have been involved in 1956. But that Lukács not pretending that the Soviet Union or China were the exact same as NATO really does put him in a different situation here. And like, I can't disagree with him. I'm not always the hugest fan of the Soviet Union in any period, but compared what they did to what NATO ended up doing, it's like apples and kumquats. They're kind of related, but not really. All right. And they're definitely not concealable or condensable to something like authoritarianism or totalitarianism. Liberalism's totalitarian. In that it actually seeks to order the totality of your life in a certain way. Anyway, man, I've got a lot to say about this. It was this, then, that more than anything else, that led to the almost complete disavowal of Lukács's later work after his 1923 History and Class Consciousness by left thinkers working in conjunction with a new post-Second World War liberalism. I think this is fair. I wish this named names instead of a historiographic tradition that's problematic, but nonetheless, it's a minor complaint. Nevertheless, the destruction of region was not subject to a systemic critique by those who opposed it. No, they didn't. That's one of the super frustrating things. When we talk about this book, I get that it's Stalinist. I don't get to talk about the specific essays, the stuff on Spengler. I mean, the founding of irrationalism and the essays on neo-Hegelianism and vitalism in imperialist Germany are worth the price of the book alone, okay? I can name 3 essays that I think are super important in this book. Instead, it was dismissed peculiarly out of hand by the Western left as constituting a deliberate perversion of the truth, a 700-page diatribe, and a Stalinist track. As one commentator noted, its reception could be summarized by a few death sentences issued against it by leading Western Marxists. Again, name names. Maybe he doesn't footnotes. Enzo Traverso, The Dialect of Irrationalism from the Introduction. All right. I like Enzo Traverso. I don't love his introduction to this book. All right. Still, there's no denying the scale of the undertaking represented by the dialect, by the destruction of reason as a critique of the main traditions of philosophical irrationalism by the world's then most esteemed Marxist philosopher. Rather than treating the various irrationalist systems of thought of the mid-19th century to 20th century as if they had simply fallen from the sky, Lukács tries to relate them to historical material developments from which they emerged. And again, the only other person who tries to do this is a fucking liberal like Isaiah Berlin, right? I actually think if you read 3 volumes of Isaiah Berlin, you want the liberal perspective on this, and you read Lukács for a communist perspective on the same stuff, you will learn a ton about both irrationalism and new romanticism in Germany and England. A ton. And that stuff matters in a way that it's hard to say. And what Lukács does, as opposed to the Berlin, is Berlin, being a liberal, puts it all about the motivating factor of ideas alone, whereas Lukács, for good and ill, tries to put it into a material perspective about why this stuff would have been popular. What are the historical material reasonings for that? In this book. I'm going to side with John Bellamy Foster on this. Rather than treating the various irrational systems of thought of the mid-19th century, mid-20th century as simply fallen from the sky, Lukács related them to historical material developments from which they emerged. Here, his argument relied ultimately on Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which is not a very long work, and a work that I see vitally important for explaining the Great Crisis of 1915 to 1945. I do think we need to pick up the mechanisms today and talk more about what has changed, but nonetheless. Irrationalism was therefore identified, as in Lenin, principally with historical material conditions of the great monopoly capitalism. Okay, now Lenin, picking up on a prior work on imperialism by Bukharin, argued that monopoly capitalism was something that was transforming society by the state's involvement into contradictions in capitalist economics. All right, and he picked it up from Bukharin, but he developed it himself, and it's particularly in his theses on imperialism where this comes up. It's not in a lot of Lenin's writings, and the argument is based off of 2 things. One thing is the thesis, and this you see in Engels and in Marx, that capitalism had a tendency towards monopoly or cartel positioning, and wanting to turn back into a rentier by having market capture. Something that you see in Marx and Engels. And this idea was developed in a couple of different places. Eugen Varga over in Hungary developed it. Ben Fine and the CPGB developed it. Victor Perlo developed it. Dan Baron and Sweezy. There's certain political implications to this. I'll quote Che Guevara here. Ever since monopoly capital took over the world, it has kept a greater part of humanity in poverty, dividing all the profits among groups of the most powerful countries. The standard in the living in those countries is based on the extreme poverty of ours. And this is this idea that later becomes the third world thesis. This had some geopolitical implications. This is part of why the Communist Party should make progressive alliances with the middle classes and small businesses against the state and big businesses. This was actually the opposite of the social democratic orientation, which is they need to decide with big businesses in order to take them over, because if they established monopoly and state was already involved, if you seize the state democratically, you could seize these businesses and use them as a mechanism of development. There's reasons why this would be, like, if you think about both the orientation of where these people are operating at, and the trade disadvantages of smaller countries and these imperial blocs, where you could see why both arguments would have emerged as a rational way to develop this, although we can also see from the Hilferding model that this ultimately led to the social democrats being associated with big business and with the problems of big business and the Weimar Republic, and that didn't go well at all. But this led to the People's Democratic Alliance. One of the things that we have today, though, is that it's unclear how we should deal with this, and like in dealing with the re-petit bourgeoisization of a lot of the economy after neoliberalism. And this is something that, talking about monopoly capitalism in 1920 and later in 1950 during Fordism, and today as if it's one continuous thing, as if just as the word throwing monopoly capital around does, is a real limitation to our material ways of understanding the problem. And I do think that the Monthly Review School is kind of guilty of throwing the term monopoly capital around without fully defining it or talking about its history or the changing of its meaning, just like they're kind of flushing all of Western Marxism together as if it was one coherent thing. Anyway, dividing up the entire world between great powers, multipolarity, haha, and the geopolitical struggles over hegemony and the spheres of influence, which a lot of people get into today. This was manifested in economic colonial rivalry between various capitalist states, coloring the entire historic context of the new imperial stage of capitalism which emerged. Today, this is a fundamental material reality in many ways persists, but does so and modified under the U.S. global imperium in the new phase of late imperialism. We hope it's late. Asterisk, we hope it's late. Which can be said to have arisen dating back to the end of the World War, merging immediately into the Cold War and perpetuated following a brief interregnum of the new Cold War today. I mean, I think you do have to deal with the differences in foreign policy between the Fordist and neoliberal period. And whatever today is, which neither resembles either the high point of neoliberalism nor Fordism. Late imperialism in this sense corresponds chronologically with the end of the Second World War, with the emergence of the nuclear age, and with the beginning of the Anthropocene epoch in geological history. I think the Anthropocene actually goes back before World War II, and I don't like the term Anthropocene. I'm with Smith. We should call it the Capitalocene. Sorry. But nonetheless, I still more or less agree with John Bellamy Foster here. These are minor historiographic nitpicks. Marked by the advent of planetary ecological crisis. The consolidation of the global monopoly capital, more recently monopoly finance capital, aka neoliberal finance capital, and the struggle, which by the way is a form of monopoly capital. To have finance capital like that requires a very, very articulated state to protect financial interest and stuff like labor arbitrage. And so seeing that as an extension of monopoly capital is absolutely correct. I don't go so far as like there's like, think about the number of rents, hidden rents, like copyright rents, branding rents, etc., that's in commodities that keep their profitability up, despite the fact that without those rents, those commodity profits are not super high. This is a fundamental change. In the struggle by the United States, backed by a collective imperialism of the United States, Canada, Europe, and Japan, for global superiority in a unipolar world, all corresponds to the phase of late imperialism. So, okay, here's the problem. We don't live in a unipolar world anymore. I don't think we've lived in a unipolar world probably since 2007. The period of unipolar imperial hubris was actually a sign that the peak of unipolarity was over. And even liberals like Fareed Zakaria could see it, right? Just to push you back in the mindset of almost 20 years ago. All right. For the Western left itself, the history of late imperialism has been primarily marked by defeat of the revolts of '68, followed by the demise of Soviet-type societies after 1989, which had as one of its primary consequences the collapse of Western social democracy, although all this was happening beforehand. It just accelerated it. Don't disagree with John Bellamy Foster here. I just want to clarify. These events placed the Western left as a whole in a weakened position, absolutely, ultimately defined by its general subordination to the broad parameters of imperialist projects centered in the United States and its refusal to align with the anti-imperialist struggle, thus guaranteeing its revolutionary irrelevance. The question that you have is, outside of obvious cases like Palestine, are decolonization within the core? There also isn't as much obvious anti-imperialist struggle of which communists are involved in any clear way after 1978. Like the national liberation period is during the period that we're talking about, like the 60s and 70s. There's still some going on. I mean, we're seeing still. I mean, Palestine is obviously the most obvious answer, but was it true that the new left refused to align with anti-imperialist struggles, or was it this left academic society of the 50s? It seems like this Western left stuff tries to flesh this out as all doing the same thing, but Maoism became super influential in the Western left in this time period, very much on anti-imperialist grounds. Here it is essential to recognize that the main battleground of the U.S. imperium over the entire period, dating back to the end of the Second World War, has been the Global South. Yes, I would agree with that. I don't disagree with this. So this is the battle not against so much explicit national liberation, but for the end of domination of national hegemony, which we should probably mark as a change in the way you have to orient this, which made it also harder for either the Soviet Union or China to intervene without also dealing with the West. I mean, do I need to go into the Sino-Soviet split, which is not being mentioned here at all? Wars and military interventions, primarily instigated by Washington, had been almost unceasing in response to revolutions and national liberation struggles, mostly inspired by Marxism. That's a big asterisk after 1978. Occurring throughout the neo-colonial and post-colonial period. Although economic development has emerged in recent decades in parts of the third world, the intensity of the exploitation and expropriation of economies in the periphery of the system, taken as a whole, has increased under globalized monopoly finance capital by the means of global labor arbitrage and debt peonage. This is the work of John Smith that I believe that John Bellamy Foster is referring to here. With the result of the polarization of the world system between the rich and poor countries having also increased. Yep. And also within those countries too. Which changes the labor aristocracy argument a good bit, actually. The labor aristocracy argument seems to have most apply before neoliberalism, but the most violent parts of U.S. imperialism are after neoliberalism, which is something I think people need to wrestle with a little bit more. The current imperial struggle, or the new Cold War initiated by Washington aimed at securing a U.S.-led unipolar world, remains centered on control of the global South, which today requires the fatal weakening of the Eurasian great powers of Russia and China that threatened a rival multipolar order contesting the U.S. unipolar system. Sure, that's true enough in abstract, although you need to go a lot more into that. In this dangerous and destructive climate of late imperialism, irrationalism was called to play a growing role in the constellation of thought. I would agree. Don't disagree there. This initially took the relatively mild form of the deconstructed postmodernism, poststructuralism, which in the works of thinkers like Jean-François Lyotard and Jacques Derrida cast aside all grand historical narratives while embracing philosophical anti-humanism emanating principally from Heidegger. In contrast, today's new philosophies of immanence associated with post-humanism, vitalistic new materialism, actor network theory, and object-oriented ontology constitute a deeper irrationalism, represented by punitively left figures such as Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Bruno Latour, Jean Benet, and Tim Morton. Asterisk. We should mention that actor network theory by Bruno Latour and object-oriented ontology by Graham Harman and Tim Morton are both Heideggerian, just to point that out. These thinkers draw directly upon an irrationalist anti-monolith intellectual lineage going back to the reactionary anti-monolism of Nietzsche, Bergson, and Heidegger. Lacanian and Hegelian philosopher Slavoj Žižek has ultimately taken sides with the anti-humanist tradition stemming from left Heideggerianism, separating in his work a carnival of irrationalism. All of these various tendencies are coupled with skepticism, nihilism, and pessimism, and end-of-the-world outlook. You have to do more than assault that, John Bellamy. I mean, I don't disagree with you, but you have to prove it. You can't just assert it. I know this is a long review when you're trying to extend the way in which this book applies, but you really have to do it. Aha! I knew it. We're going to get to Baron and Sweezy. Writing on the irrational system in the finer chapter of Monopoly Capital, Paul Baron and Paul M. Sweezy explored the destruction of reason which have come to pervade every aspect of modern capitalist society, which, by the way, had already been done 20 years before them by Christopher Caldwell, but nonetheless. From the irrationality of the economic system, which, I mean, John Bellamy Foster would know because they're the monthly reviews who publishes Christopher Caldwell, to its elemental destructiveness of social life, atomization, the way in which we've tried to bring the Hobbesian myth into reality. Thus, they pointed to an ever-sharpening conflict between the rapidly advancing rationalization of the entire process of production and the undiminished elementality or irrationality of the system as a whole, which I think is an interesting insight. Although it's also not that different from the point made in the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Horkheimer and Adorno. The problem that Horkheimer and Adorno have with this book is this book implies for the Soviet Union's flaws, and remember, Lukács would say there was some. He participated in 1956. That it was still superior to what's happening in the West, whereas in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, they want to portray those societies as fundamentally the same, or maybe the West is slightly better. All right. Even if it's still fascistic, which is a weird splitting of the baby that you see in that period of Frankfurt School. The crux of crushes of the Marxist insight, Baron wrote in a letter to Sweezy, was that the driving force of class-based revolution was always the identity of material interest and the needs of a class with the reasons of criticisms of the existing irrationality. Irrationalism in bourgeois culture, therefore, had its main object separating any potentially revolutionary class from the realm of rational critique, while substituting instinct myth and the continuing vomiting up of reason as Fyodor Dostoevsky's Underground Man and Notes from the Underground. All of this was linked materially and ideologically to imperialism, barbarism, and fascism. I like John Bellamy Foster's defense of this book, but so far, most of this defense is actually not at all about what Lukács wrote in here. It's mostly about the Baron and Sweezy school. In Barin's conception analysis that Peru's reason divorced from a connection to material reality and class took a purely ideational form, it followed that the defense of reason, not in the purely ideational sense, but connected to the real material forces below, was an indispensable part of the socialist struggle. Yes, I would agree with that. For all my criticisms of the economics implied on Baron and Sweezy and the way that they seem to take the 50s as an eternal development, which John Bellamy Foster does not. I want to be clear on that. It's also pretty clear to me that this part of their thinking was actually pretty dumb. Hence, exposing a dialectic of irrationalism and imperialism playing out in our time, an era when the development of productive forces no longer serves to disguise the destructiveness of the global capitalist system, now threatening on humanity, needs to be a primary goal of the left. Unreason in history. Irrationalism in the late 19th to early 20th century was a well-known current of European philosophy. Yep. See the book, The Death of Reason. It's a history of that in the 19th century. Not a Marxist book, but it's a good one. You should check it out. Drawing inspiration from various emphasis on the will to life, will to power, instincts, intuitions, myths, and vitalistic principles, seen mostly in people like Sorel, even on the left, as well as a deep social pessimism and opposition to the earlier Enlightenment emphasis on materialism, reason, science, and progress. It took the form of deeply reactionary movements that were virulently anti-humanistic, anti-democratic, anti-scientific, anti-socialist, and anti-dialectical, as well as frequently racist and misogynist. Some leading figures in this irrationalist turn in the period from 1848 to 1932 include Schopenhauer, who was a weird neo-Kantian, Edward von Hartmann, Nietzsche, Sorel, Spengler, Bergson, Heidegger, and Schmidt. And it's interesting to me that the irrationalist side of this is the side of, say, like Schmidt and Heidegger have been recuperated by someone like Werner Sombart, who got into some of the materialistic thinkings of Nazis, and in being a former Marxist, he would. He's been written out of the canon, interestingly. But Heidegger and Schmidt get to stay. Such philosophical rationalism was the intellectual generalization of a larger historical influences occurring within the dominant society. Hence, the direct causal links with reactionary movements are often lacking. However, the broad, I think this is true, but we have to do more with this and just assert it. However, the broad connection between these ideational tendencies and the eventual emergence of fascism, and particularly Nazism in Europe, is undeniable. Sorel professed his admiration for Benito Mussolini. Yes, he did, although he also professed admiration for Lenin, although he did so in an irrationalist way. Heidegger and Schmidt were Nazi ideologues and functionaries. Yep. And I like how that part of Schmidt gets written out of people. People will pretend that Schmidt was a conservative revolutionary and not like someone like Ernst Jünger, who was his friend, and not a fascist, which he was explicitly. All right. None other than Hitler captured the spirit of unreason present at the time when he declared, "We stand at the end of the age of reason. A new era of magical explanation of the world is rising. An explanation based on will rather than knowledge. There is no truth, either in the moral or scientific sense." Approaching the problem of irrationalism from the Marxist perspective, Lukács in The Destruction of Reason traces its historical roots to the defeat of bourgeois revolutions of 1848, followed by the emergence of the imperialist stage of capitalism beginning with the last quarter of the 19th century. I think Lukács would have done well to also tie irrationalism and Bonapartism together. It's implied as Bonapartism is the primary form of imperialism for Marx and Engels. So, yeah. Leading to the First and Second World Wars. Quote, reason itself, he argued, can never be something politically neutral, suspended above social developments. It always mirrors the concrete rationality or irrationality of the social situation and evolving trends, sums it up conceptually, and thereby promotes or inhibits it. It is an imminent critique based on the scrutiny of changing historical conditions that constitutes the essence of the Marxian dialectical method in the analysis of development of thought. Dead on, John Bellamy Foster. Totally agree with you there. For Lukács, Schopenhauer was the originator of the purely bourgeois vision of irrationalism. Being a neo-Kantian, he would be. Anyway, his magnum opus, The World as Will and Idea, published in 1819, was directed against the Hegelian philosophy. Schopenhauer attempted to oppose his subjective idealism of the will to George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's objectivist idealism of reason. In doing so, he went so far as to schedule his lecture in Berlin in the 1820s opposite to those of Hegel's own, but to no avail, since he was unable to attract an audience. Although we can't say that all the Hegelianism of the 1830s was great. It was only after the defeat of the 1848 revolutions in Germany that the overall climate shifted in his direction. Cultural pessimism would after your optimists get crushed. At that point, the German bourgeoisie shifted their alliance from Hegel to Ludwig Feuerbach, then to Schopenhauer, who in the last decade of his life achieved widespread acclaim. Schopenhauer's genius, according to Lukács, was the pioneering method of indirect apologetics, later perfected by Nietzsche. Earlier, apologetics of the bourgeois order had sought to defend it directly, despite its manifold contradictions. And Schopenhauer's new method of indirect apologetics, the bad side of capitalism and even its contradictions could be brought into the open. This was never attributed to the capitalist system, but to egoism, instincts, and will, perceived human existence in a deeply pessimistic terms as the vice-ridden process of self-disillusion. Schopenhauer's concept of the will, or the will to life, which he attributes to all existence, took the form of a cosmic egoism. By reducing everything to the pure will, Schopenhauer's philosophy, Lukács wrote, anthropomorphizes the whole of nature. I agree, Lukács is right there. The will for Schopenhauer, embraced by Immanuel Kant's thing in themselves, the noumena, beyond human perception. I must recognize, Schopenhauer declared, the inscrutable forces which manifest themselves in all natural bodies as identical with that in which in me is the will, and as differing from it only in degree. This noumena stuff in Kant is actually, and thing in itself is actually really important for a whole lot of German irrationalism, and neo-Kantianism in specific bears a lot of blame for this. Schopenhauer's notion of the will was perhaps the best revealed by his response to Baruch Spinoza's famous statement that a falling stone, if it were conscious, would think it had free will, and that its momentum was the product of its own volition. An argument designed to refute the notion of free will. Schopenhauer inverted Spinoza's meaning and declared the stone would be right. The path is the same for the stone as the motive for me, and what is manifested in the stone's case as cohesion, gravity, and persistence in the assumed state is, in esoteric essence, the same as that in which I recognize in myself as will. For Schopenhauer, crude materialism simply denied the immanence of those vital forces that were identical with the will to life, beyond which there was, quote, nothing. The late 19th century was a period associated in part with the growth of neo-Kantianism in philosophy. Thank you. Thank you, John Bellamy Foster, for mentioning that. Beginning with Friedrich Lange's the materialism and critique in its present importance, which sought to overthrow all materialist tendencies, notably Karl Marx's historical materialism. But even more influential and geared to the new imperialist age was irrationalism as a general philosophical tendency, as seen in German Romanticism in specific. We should think about that too. Schopenhauer's leading follower outside of Nietzsche, on whom he exercised a considerable influence, and the dominant figure in the philosophical irrationalism in the late 19th century was Hartmann, with the massive tome, The Philosophy of the Unconscious. I do think we have to talk about the later German idealists too, like Fichte, who have an irrationalist term, but that's beyond today. A more eclectic thinker than Schopenhauer, Hartmann professed to be bringing together Hegel's optimism with Schopenhauer's pessimism. But it was the deep pessimism and irrationalism of Hartmann's work that most impressed readers at the time, marked specifically by his notion of cosmic suicide. I haven't read Hartmann that much, so I don't really know much about this. In Hartmann's view, this was the best of all possible worlds, but non-existence was superior to existence. Yes. This is a precursor to like David Benatar's like negative utilitarianism, where we should just, be anti-natalist and hope that everybody dies because death is preferable to life in utilitarian calculus. We see this in Hartmann, but in a German idealist as opposed to English mode. Hence, he believed that at some point the will, or the unconscious spirit, will become so warped in the human species that at the height of its development, it would lead to cosmic suicide, bringing about a temporal end to the entire world process, resulting in the last day. At that point, quote, the human negation of the will would annihilate the whole actual volition of the world without residuum, and cause the whole cosmos to disappear by a stroke of withdrawal of the volition, which alone gives it existence. We see this idea that human volition or human beingness gives beingness existence in Heidegger too, but we'll come to that. Humanity's end would not take the form of a traditional apocalypse, a coming from without, but would emanate from the suicide of the will, extending to the universe as a whole. Nietzsche died in 1900. The date is significant since, in Lukács' view, Nietzsche was the founder of irrationalism in the imperialist period, which was only then commencing. This is what angers a lot of my platypus friends about Lukács' book, because it's anti-Nietzsche. The imperialist and monopoly stage of capitalism, Marxist theory, began in the last quarter of the 19th century, but in terms of Nietzsche's life and work, Only the shoots and buds of what to come in that respect were visible. Nietzsche's genius was instinctively to capture a sense of what was to come and develop a method of irrationalism for the new age of empire as a mythologizing form of analysis, made more obscure by frequent use of aphorisms. It is this that accounts for the mesmerizing nature of Nietzsche's literary style, which was at the same time a means of perfecting indirect apologetics. Everything in Nietzsche is present. I bet, let's see where we get that. That's going to be, oh no, okay, it's from Lucero. Not Lucero, from Lukács. Everything in Nietzsche is presented in a haze so that the whole of the political social thrust of his philosophy is not in doubt, but also gives rise to endless discussion arising from his mythic character and establishing the dominant form in which philosophical rationalism is proved to this day. I mean, I was just reading Carlos Gómez de Villa, who does the same thing, clearly inspired by Nietzsche. Summarizing the main character of Nietzsche's philosophy, Lukács wrote, "The more fictive a concept is and the more purely subjectivist its origins, the higher it stands and the truer it is in the mythical scale of values. Being, so long as its concept contains even the slightest vestiges of a relationship to reality independent of our consciousness, must be placed by becoming equals idea. Being, however, when freed from these shackles and viewed purely as fiction, as a product of the will to power, may then, for Nietzsche, be a higher category than becoming, an expression of the intuitive pseudo-objectivity of myth. When Nietzsche, the special function of such a definition of becoming and being lies in supporting the pseudo-history vital to his indirect apologetics and simultaneously dismissing it, confirming philosophically that being the historical becoming can produce nothing that is new and outruns capitalism. Yet, for all the brilliance and even attraction of Nietzsche's philosophy, its systemic reactionary and irrationalist character cannot be denied." Yeah, I actually agree, by the way. I like Nietzsche's philosophy, but I do not disagree that it is fundamentally reactionary and irrationalist. I consider it the highest form of irrationalist reactionary philosophy and something that we have to contend with seriously, but I'm not going to absolve it of that. At the end of his World as Will and Idea, Schopenhauer had then declared the will to life was everything, beyond which there was nothing. Nietzsche, in a play on Schopenhauer, famously pronounced, "The world is the will to power and nothing besides, and you yourself are this will to power and nothing besides." In Beyond Good and Evil in 1886, Nietzsche, in opposition to Marxism, wrote, I don't know, it's still unclear to me how much Nietzsche knew about Marxism when he was talking about socialism. He does seem to have some knowledge, but he never seemed to read Marx. "Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of what is alien and weaker, suppression, hardness, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and at least the mildest exploitation. If it is a living and not dying body, it will have to be an incarnate will to power. It will strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant, not from any morality or immorality, but because it is living and because life simply is will to power. There is no point on which the ordinary consciousness of Europeans resists the instruction as on this. Everywhere people are now waving under scientific disguises about coming conditions of society in which the exploited aspect will be removed, which sounds to me as if they promised to invent a new way of life that would dispense with all organic functions. Exploitation does not belong to corrupt or imperfect or primitive society. It belongs to the essence of what lives, as its basic organic function, its consequence of the will to power, which is, after all, the will of life." Here, Nietzsche conflates appropriation, which is in the classical political theory and the work of thinkers such as John Locke, Hegel, and Marx, meant the process of acquiring property, and which for Marx ultimately involved production, with actual exploitation. Moreover, in Nietzsche's uses, exploitation was no different than expropriation, that is, appropriation without equivalent or reciprocity. Thus, in a sleight of hand, appropriation, which is the basis of life, becomes equated with exploitation, expropriation, which is not essential to existence, thereby shutting off any notion of an egalitarian or humane future. Yeah, that's true. Nietzsche's definitely onto that. However, Nietzsche ultimately grounds his view here in biological determinism, which he tells us constitutes the essence of the will to power. In this way, his essentialism with respect to human nature differs from that of Thomas Hobbes, only insofar as the latter, in the historical context of the 17th century, was a progressive rather than regressive thinker. Beyond Leviathan, by Esteban Merazos, which I have not read, but I want to, because I've become obsessed with the dialectical nature of Hobbes and why I think he's both the best and worst of liberalism simultaneously, as both the first liberal and first anti-liberal in the same person in the English tradition. Nietzsche's writing exhibits endless attacks on socialism and even democracy. Socialism, he wrote, was the logical conclusion of the tyranny of the least and dumbest. In a twist on Darwinism, which he appropriated in form of a mere cliche along the lines of the social Darwinist, he argued that rather than the survival of the fittest, European society was characterized by the survival of the unfittest. In this view, the mediocre masses are the herd animals were taking over society by force of numbers, from which more noble elements, so that it was the noble spirit that needed to be protected by means of force. We see this in the love of the movie Idiocracy today, which I've done commentary on. We shall perish, he wrote, because of the absence of slavery. Yeah, Nietzsche wrote that. Detesting bourgeois society, but detesting democracy and socialism even more, Nietzsche declared, such phantoms of dignity of man, the dignity of labor, are shabby products of the slave mentality hiding from its own nature. Modern society for Nietzsche interfered with the natural hierarchy of races, constituting an age that mixes races indiscriminately, beyond good and evil. This called for the reassertion of a master race, which he depicted in Aryan terms as connected to the blonde German beast, to be found at the center of every noble race. Yeah, I think the Walter Kaufmanization about his, hatred of anti-Semitism, which was real, although idiosyncratic, does kind of belie the obviousness of the blonde Germanic beast stuff. In contrast, the descendants of all European and non-European slavery, particularly all the pre-Aryan population, represents the decline of mankind. On the genealogy of morals, this is an interesting note. Deleuze oddly sees Nietzsche's concept of the overman as his final triumph over Hegel's dialectics. That's weird. Glorifying in the defeat of the Paris Commune, Nietzsche referred to it as the most primitive form of social structure since it represented the interests of the herd. He worried about the tragic fate awaiting the conqueror master race of the Aryan and democratic and socialist age. Such conquering Aryan humanity was characterized as originally blonde and pure and primordial, as opposed to previous dark-skinned, dark-haired inhabitants of Europe and elsewhere. Twilight of the Idols, of Genealogy of Morals. And Will to Power, this book is, I will say, the whether or not you think Will to Power is legitimate is how much you think Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche altered the text. The great majority of men have no right to life and serve only to discord the elect of our race. I do not yet grant the unfit that right. These are even unfit peoples, lacking the right to exist. Here is the following translation of the perils of translation are doing justice to a text. Kaufman's translation of Will to Power leaves out the last two sentences. Nietzsche, Will to Power. See also Ron Bariner's Dangerous Minds, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and the Return of the Far Right. University of Pennsylvania Press, 2018, excuse me. And I think we do have to contend with that. In Nietzsche's notion of eternal recurrence, the noble spirits and the master race will again experience the triumph of the will in the cyclic swings of history. Yet, eternal recurrence meant a lacking of overall progress, so that the human result was nothingness, the meaninglessness forevermore. Although Nietzsche risked to supersede nihilism through the overman as a personification of the will to power, it was to nihilism that everything was always eternally returned, as the general form of progress was foreclosed. Vitalism, or Lieben philosophy, was, in Lukács' conception, the dominant philosophy of the whole imperial period in Germany. However, vitalism had its foremost representative in the period in the work of Bergson in France. Bergson's philosophy rested on two forms of consciousness, intellect, and intuition. The intellect related to the mechanical world of natural sciences, intuition to metaphysics, and thus the realm of philosophy. He believed that by looking inward into the intuitive realm, it was possible to solve problems like the character of time and evolution in ways that comprehended and went beyond science and reason. Thus, he challenged, as Lukács put it, the scientific character of normal scientific knowledge, thus creating a stock confrontation of rationality and irrationalist intuition. Bergson's two most important concepts were those of time as subjective duration and élan vital, or vital impulse. The basis of these concepts, he proposed a kind of third way in philosophy existing outside of the mechanistic materialism and idealism teleology. Time, he stated, is the invention, or it is nothing at all. The moment we confront the duration, we see that it means creation. Our lives give us clues and to unlock the secret of time, or the ability to endure, since duration was not an attribute of matter itself, but that of life, which rescinds the course of matter. The élan vital was the creative impulse of life, lightening up matter, which explained evolution. On these essentially mystical bases, Bergson went on to challenge Charles Darwin's theory of evolution as natural selection and Albert Einstein's conception of space-time for failing to capture the subjective, intuitive, and creative basis of existence. Bergson was born in 1859, the year of the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, but he never accepted Darwin's theory of natural selection, like many people today, arguing that natural science was inadequate in this area, and thus there must be some vital creative impulse, a cosmic élan vital, underlying all evolution. Utilizing arguments that are now employed by advocates of intelligent design, for example, that the evolution of the eye could not be explained by natural selection, he attributed creative evolution to the vital power independent of matter and organization. Bergson's attacks on Darwinian theory of natural selection and on reason in general caused E. Ray Lancaster, the protege of Darwin and Thomas Huxley, a close friend of Marx and the leading British biologist of his day, to rebel at Bergson's presentation of intuition as the true guide of the intellect as an erroneous guide. In assessing Bergson's contribution, Lancaster, a strict materialist, wrote, "To the student of the aberrations and monstrosities of man, Monsieur Bergson's work will always be documents of value, akin to the interest that a collector may take in the curious species of beetle." Socialist biologists subsequently transcended the debate between mechanistics and vitalists via material dialectics, which contributed a major contribution to science. See Sandowski, the process inorganic, the physical and biological and process of organic evolution, and Nikolai Bukharin at All Science at the Crossroads, and Time in the Refreshing River. All right. I agree with that, I think. I feel uncomfortable speaking to what's meant by that. Bergson was incensed by Einstein's theory of relativity, which interpreted time or space-time in terms of physics and was gradually receiving general recognition. In a famous face-off in April 1922, Bergson argued in opposition to Einstein that the physical notion of time professed by the intellect was inadequate and that time could only be fully understood when approached subjectively and intuitively in terms of duration. Einstein responded that the time of the philosophers complaining both physical time and psychical time, physical time does not exist. There remains only a physiological time that differs from that of the physicist. For Einstein, neither Bergson's élan vital nor his duration had any meaning in terms of physical science. In Lukács' view, there's no such thing as an innocent philosophy. This was clearly the case where Heidegger was concerned, despite its rarefied aspect. In Heidegger's 1927 masterpiece, Being and Time, the consideration of individual beings is downplayed in the search for fundamental ontology, the metaphysic of being. He proposed that being can be approached on the basis of an existential analytic find in Dasein, our human existence, which, as he later explained, can be perceived as dwelling in or performing the role of the shepherd of being. Hence, although being for Heidegger cannot be apprehended directly, it can be disclosed in part phenomenologically and existentially by the scrutiny of Dasein in the context of becoming with the world. All previous philosophies from Plato to the modern era were deemed by Heidegger to be superficial and narrowly metaphysical, insofar as they did not focus on the fundamental ontology of the problem of being. One consequence of Heidegger's philosophy was to decenter the consciousness, the transcendental ego, and to shift philosophy from questions of subject-object relations to authenticity and inauthenticity. Cough, cough. For all my problems with Adorno, some of which I do agree with John Bellamy Foster on, I think Adorno's takedown of authenticity of inauthenticity is really important in the jargon of authenticity. Given the preceded being as such as the main thrust of Heidegger's existential analytic, one might think that it would not have much relation to politics and ethics. Yet, the reactionary, irrational, and vialistic elements of Heidegger's philosophy, while not present on the surface, seeped out in various ways, exhibiting its true nature of his irrationalist logic. This occurred not simply in his official Nazi period, but also in his later works after the war, and was arguably implicit in the whole philosophical position from the beginning. Thus, in his published lectures on Being and Time, presented at the University of Freiburg in the winter of 1933-1934, shortly after he joined the Nazi Party and only a few years after the publication of Being and Time, Heidegger declared, "An enemy is each and every person who poses an essential threat to Dasein, existence of the people and its individual members." You can already see this mirrored in Smith. The enemy does not have to be external. The external enemy is not always the most dangerous one. And it can seem as if there is no enemy, but then it is the fundamental requirement to find the enemy, to expose the enemy to the light, or even first to make the enemy. So is that this standing against the enemy may happen, and so Dasein may not lose its edge. The challenge is to bring the enemy into the open, to harbor no illusions about the enemy, to keep oneself ready for attack, to cultivate and intensify a constant readiness, and to prepare the attack looking ahead with the goal of total annihilation. Heidegger's role as a Nazi Party functionary, ideologue, and during his years as rector at the University of Freiburg, the most prominent academic support of Hitler are now well known. He helped institute Gleichschaltung, or the bringing into line with the German Academy, playing a leading role in the purging of the university of colleagues and students who failed to conform to the dictates of the Nazi regime. He also worked closely with the legal theorist Carl Schmitt, the main author of the notorious Führer principle, promoting Nazi ideology and presiding over the symbolic book burnings. In his 1935 Introduction to Metaphysics, not only provided a tribute to Nazism as an advancement, an argument for the triumph of the historical folk, the people, and therefore the history of the West, activating new spiritual energies. In conversation with Karl Lowith in Heidelberg in 1936, Heidegger agreed without reservation to the suggestion that his partisanship of National Socialism lay in the essence of his philosophy. Heidegger frequently lauded Mussolini and Hitler, presenting Nietzsche as the forerunner of both fascist leaders. And Heidegger's book on Friedrich Schilling, a long sentence from the original lecture, was omitted in the 1971 edition, but was later reinserted at Heidegger's own request. It said, "As is well known, both the two men in Europe who have, in political national fashioning of their respective volks, inaugurated counter-movements, Gegenbewegung, to nihilism, namely Mussolini and Hitler, were in turn, each in their own way, essentially determined by Nietzsche. Still that this was so without Nietzsche's authentic metaphysical domain having come into its own. Nietzsche," Heidegger explained in his lectures, "had shown that democracy led to degenerative forms of nihilism and thus demanded a more authentic folk movement." In a course on logic in 1934, Heidegger declared that Negroes are but men that have no history. Nature has no history. When an airplane's propeller turns, then nothing actually occurs. Conversely, when the same airplane takes Hitler to Mussolini, then history occurs. Quote, "The sham of culture of Western civilization," he explained, "will be superseded only by the spiritual world of the folk, based on the deepest preservation of the forces of soil and blood." In his infamous Black Notebooks, a philosophical diary Heidegger asked to be included at the end of his collected works, he gave repeated evidence of his deep anti-Semitism. Thus, he attributed the false modernity and Western rationalism to world Judaism, a term used in Hitler's Mein Kampf, referring to the Jewish conspiracy of world domination. World Judaism, Heidegger wrote in the Black Notebooks, is ungraspable everywhere because of its dominance of rationalist thought and does not need to get involved in military action while continuing to unfurl its influences. Whereas we, Nazi Germany in the Second World War, are led to sacrifice the best blood of our people. Following the publication of the Black Notebooks, as Heidegger scholar Tom Rockmore has noted, it seems increasingly clear that Heidegger's philosophy, his turning to National Socialism and his anti-Semitism are neither separate nor separable, but rather inseparably linked. It is clear that Heidegger never moved away or intended to distance himself from his extreme reactionary views, which underpinned his whole philosophical effort. In his famous lecture on humanism published in 1947, he provided a systemic attack on humanism, disparaging the German Enlightenment thinkers such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Friedrich Schiller. Unlike today's post-humanism, however, Heidegger was chiefly concerned with negating the notion of human beings as the primary material corporal beings, having an animal rationale. For Heidegger, truth lay in the existential analytic of Dasein, concealing real human existence as approaching being. In his usual veiled language, Heidegger heralded a destiny still to come, based on a historicity more primordial, closer to Dasein than humanism. Humanism, which he identified with rationalism, was at times to be opposed, because it does not set humanitas high enough in promoting the empiricist ontic of the mere individual material beings, as opposed to the fundamental ontology of being, in which the conscious ego is decentered. Heidegger intimated that, due to language he saw as the center of Dasein, there was a close relationship between ancient Greek and German cultures. We see this all over 19th century German nationalism, which was to pick up on Greek because it was a way for them to oppose the English, who picked up on Roman motifs. There's long cultural histories on this. You should read them. Along was generally conceived to be along Aryan line. This made Germany a unique and furthering the authentic historicity of the West. In his letter on humanism, Heidegger acknowledged the power of Marx's critique of alienation before proceeding to criticize materialism and reducing Marx's theory of alienation to an issue of technology. As Lukács stated, there is no doubt that Heidegger was saying here, namely that Marxism as a chief antagonist. Yeah, I've seen people try to use this to say that Heidegger and Marxists are copacetic. They are not. The new irrationalism. Lukács identified the growth of irrationalism when the imperialist stage of capitalism. We said that a bunch already. But anyway, this was conceived in the first place economically along the lines of Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg as a system of monopoly capitalism characterized in terms of inter-imperialist rivalry and war and the struggle over colonies and the sphere of influence. But it was Lenin, above all, according to Lukács, who translated the economic conceptions of imperialism into a theory of the concrete world situation created by imperialism, focusing on cross politics and alignments between nations. Moreover, Lenin recognized that peace agreements in the imperialist stage were inevitably nothing more than a truce between periods of war, with a larger geopolitical struggle inherent to monopoly capitalism. The political aspects of imperialism thus culminated the cultural hoard of whole nations, generating what Wayman Williams in another context was called the structure of feeling. This is a real subsumption point, actually. It was led to the interface of imperialism and irrationalism in history from Europe from 1870 to 1945. Late imperialism, beginning in 1945, can be divided thus into three separate periods. So, the immediate Cold War from 1945 to 1991, in which the United States, as a hegemonic power of the capitalist world economy, sought to gain dominance over the global South, engaged in anti-colonial revolt, while at the same time raging global struggle against the Soviet Union and China. You got to mention that you cannot not mention the Sino-Soviet conflict in that. You cannot not mention, because China helped the United States. To erase that in discussing this erases the fissure and fundamental contradiction in the way socialist history played out and what led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So many people want to erase it because it makes a unified counter theory really hard. And I do fault the monthly review for not exploring that enough. And I think that's a major fault in the publication. The period from 1991 to 2008, in which Washington attempted to consolidate a permanent unipolar world in the vacuum left by the removal of the Soviet Union from the world stage and the opening up of China to the world economy, Although I'm going to say, I think you have to add a 2 about the Sino-Soviet split and how that changed the dynamics of the Cold War fundamentally. Then 3 and 4, which are now 2 and 3, would still be true. This one we might call literally the period of neoliberalism's dominance, although neoliberalism began in the late 1970s. Its dominance is from 1991 to 2008. From 2008, from the great financial crisis to the present, marked by the reemergence of China and Russia as great powers. The latter is somewhat debatable. As a major power, yes. But India is also a power about the size of Russia in world economic forums, but cannot be seen as easily as an anti-imperialist term, so it's excluded from this. That's kind of sloppy. And Washington's official designation of these two countries as its chief enemies, leading to a new Cold War, marked by a conflict between the US-centered unipolar world and an emerging multipolar world. Except that it admits that there's a debate on how to fight that Cold War between the right, as heralded by John Mearsheimer, who thinks we need to warm up to Russia to pull it out of China's orbit so we can attack China. That's Tucker Carlson believes the same thing, versus people think that China and Russia need to coalesce to create a counter imperialistic hegemon of multipolarity, which, I think is neither good nor bad, actually. It could probably be good depending on how it plays out. But that isn't the same thing as anti-imperialism. Multipolarity actually implies imperialism. And I don't like the way this publication in general ignores that. And they do it for kind of obvious reasons. During all this time, the Western left has occupied a weakened position with the monopoly capitalism at home, while having an ambiguous approach to imperialism abroad with the related submergence of the class struggle. It also suffered major defeat in 1968 with the advent of the new Cold War. The hybrid war of collective imperialism, the triad of the global South, including the major emerging economies, has come fully to light. Yes, I don't disagree with that. But under these circumstances, bourgeois rationalism has come to define the dominant intellectual climate of late imperialism, reflecting the continuing destruction of reason. I mean, I think the counter-hegemonic to that is John Bellamy Foster. The only reason people read you is 2007 happened. Today, it is widely recognized that German reactionary thought associated with the Nietzsche, Heidegger, Carl Schmitt connection, along with the revival of Bergsonism, is present in the works of post-Marxists, post-modernists, and post-humanists, from Derrida to Deleuze to Latour. Yeah, but this was their major heyday. Latour and Deleuze in particular, Latour and Derrida in particular, were actually before 2007. Deleuze's major heyday is now. So again, you need to be a little bit more sharp with your historiographic teeth if you're going to have a historiographic theory of world imperialism, and be sloppy with your timeline. In this case, it really does matter that you get this stuff right. In the words of Katie Khrushchev, the fascination with negativity and nihilism, characteristic of irrational philosophers in the 19th century and early 20th century, can be seen in the works of Deleuze and Guattari, are the accelerationist dystopia and post-humanist theories of the present. See Nick Land et al., which are explicitly that. In Deleuze's Nietzschean philosophy, we are told that the resolutely anti-dialectic character of Nietzsche's thought, his concept of the will to power, the eternal return, and the dream of the overman, represent a triumph over Hegel's dialectic, leading to the created identity of power and willing as a consummation of the will to power. There's a secret link connecting the various thinkers opposed to the state philosophy. This secret link, Deleuze tells us, includes Spinoza, reinterpreted as a vitalist, Nietzsche, and Bergson, all of whom are to be seen as philosophers of immanence, representing a nomadic tradition opposed not only to the European rationalism in general, but standing in direct opposition to Hegel and Marx. Bergson's position in this debate with Einstein as championed by Deleuze in his 1966 book Bergsonism, which I think people need to read, and is why I don't like Deleuze, in an effort to privilege once again the subjective, intuitive nature of the time, separated from physics and also from historical time. The irrationalist and reactionary reversals we are seeing within what still remains a punitively left analysis are many, as Khrushchev observes. In Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Deleuze and Guattari find capital monstrous, but at the same time a desirable terrain from which the subversion and its emancipatory potential may stem. Nonetheless, the acceptance of vicious capitalist contemporaneity is inevitable given the condition of the impossibility of a sublation. A very important aspect of such an aberration lies in the following. The capitalist undercurrents of these emancipatory and critical theories function not as a program to exit from capitalism, but rather as a radicalization of the impossibility of this exit. This is revealing, and the impossibility of the exit can be seen in Deleuze and Guattari's main confrontation with Marx. At the beginning of their influential 1972 work, Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, they posit an industrial nature relation resulting in relatively autonomous sphere, that are called production, distribution, and consumption. These separate spheres, they claim, were demonstrated by Marx to be only the products of capitalist division of labor and the false consciousness that it produced. But from there, they leap to a trans-historical position. Yeah, they do that a lot. Even though I would like to be less like this historiographical tendency to be more nailed down, I tend to share these critiques of Deleuze and Guattari. We make no distinction between nature and between man and nature. The human essence of nature and the natural essence of man, Marx's phrase, become one within nature and the form of production or industry, just as they do within the life of man as a species. Industry is no longer considered from the extrinsic point of view of utility, but from the point of view of its fundamental identity with nature as a production of man and by man. This is reducing production to social reproduction, by the way. This is the move. Man and nature are not two opposite terms confronting each other. Rather, they are one and the same essential reality that produce the product. On this basis, nature and humanity are seen as an inescapable ideal unity. What Marx, who is being quoted here, called the human essence of nature and the natural essence of man. This is inevitably the result of industry as an abstract trans-historical phenomenon, which, rather than being conceived as alienated under capitalism, as in Marx, is a direct, immediate means of unification of nature and humanity. The entire concept of alienation, or the self-estrangement of humanity, as a central material reality of capitalism, which Marx had presented as a tragic flaw that had to be superseded, is thus removed from the outset. Abso-fucking-lutely. 100% with you on this, John Bellamy Foster. Nature and humanity for Deleuze and Guattari are one essential reality generated by an industry in the abstract. Having effectively eliminated the historic phenomenon of alienation, Deleuze and Guattari move immediately to the characterization of production as an eminent principle of desiring machines, leading to a universal schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, in the sense, is defined as the universe of productive and reproductive desiring machines, representing a universal primary production as the essential reality of man and nature. Marxist alienation, resulting from estranged social relations, is thus replaced by a universal system of desiring machines, or a machinic unconscious, producing a larger schizophrenic reality in which capitalism is mere manifestation. I'm actually surprised from when I read this stuff in the 90s and aughts. I started reading Deleuze in high school because it was so hip in the college-educated humanities world that I saw in a lot of the zines that I was reading. I've never really bought this stuff, to be quite frank. I've tried to give Guattari's relationship to Marxism more prominence and seeing him as a mere anti-Marxist, but I don't think you can take the damage they do. And it's not just here. I mean, they do weird stuff with the MCM circuit too, and trans-historicize that as well. Yeah, we'll get into that. The schizophrenic desiring machine reality lies on the plane of immanence superseding humanity itself. Thus, we are confronted with a universe of libidinal energy, vitalized forces, and desiring mechanic drives from which there was no escape. Nietzsche's reactionary irrationalism triumphs over Marxist revolutionary praxis. A similar reversal can be seen in Derrida, related to Heidegger, and again revealed in the relation to Marx and Derrida's famous specters of Marx. In this and other works, Derrida advanced a left Heideggerian post-structuralist perspective. The immediate public response to specters of Marx, written shortly after the demise of the Soviet Union, was that it reaffirmed Marx. Yet this occurred in the form of an indirect apologetics that stressed Marx's spectology, hauntology, yay. Here, Derrida focuses on the famous opening lines of the manifesto in which Marx and Engels had written, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." Marxism, he argued, still continued to haunt Europe, if only in a ghostly sense, in which it played an indispensable role in continuing to challenge the capitalist monolith. Yet Derrida's Marx, or the Marx he wished to retain, was, in the words of Richard Rowland, a Heideggerized Marx, one impoverished by the notion that the main enemy is now simply techno-scientific modernity. Bam! Thus, the beginnings of a lot of popularities of primitivism. Hence, the ontological presence of the anti-humanistic Heideggerian inheritance rule out all the substance of Marx's theory, including social forces behind revolutionary praxis. Indeed, Marxist spectrology, Derrida explains, was not limited to Marx himself, but blinks and sparkles behind the prior names of Marx, Freud, and Heidegger. Hence, Marx continued to heart capitalism, but not simply as an apparition of himself, but as a ghost of Heidegger as well, whose epoch thinking cancels historicity. The new philosophies of immanence thus have produced all sorts of seemingly radical, but in fact reactionary theories. This is evident in the post-humanist treatment of the ecological crisis, particularly in the form of what is called the new materialism. Much of this is informed by Deleuze's questionable reappropriation of Spinoza as a vitalistic theorist, primarily through the later concept of conatus, which is interpreted as an imputing motive, mind, or even joy to objects themselves, for example, even a throne. This is where object-oriented ontology comes from. It's combining Spinoza with Heidegger. This has opened the way to a vast outpouring of the new vitalistic, so-called new materialistic works by such figures as Binet and Morton, often in the name of ecology, in which a universal animism is the outcome. In this view, a lump of coal, a microbe, Adorno set of plastic dinosaurs, a stone, etc., all treated as having vital powers, placing them on a flat ontological plane with humanity, hence the object-oriented ontology. Like Schopenhauer in his response to Spinoza, Binet argues that a falling stone, if it were conscious, would be right to think that it had the will and moved of its own volition. The result is a demolition of any meaningful distinction between human and non-human nature. Which, in and of itself, I mean, we can get into that. I think this is beyond the scope of me talking about in this essay. I do think there is a problematic in the way nature is formed in the Enlightenment as a concept, but I don't think this object-oriented ontology stuff gets you any clearer lines of thinking. A common strategy to be found in Latour, Binet, and Morton is to negate Marx's famous critique of the commodity fetishism by simply standing it on its head, presenting all things and objects as vital agents or actors. This amounts to a universalization of commodity fetishism and reification, the thingification of the world, and thus diminishing thereby any notion of the human subject. It constitutes the elimination of the classical conception of critique. Latour's well-known rejection of the modern sought to deny, in left Heideggerian fashion, all validity to the concepts of nature and humanity, presented them as a false duality introduced by Enlightenment modernity. He made this rejection of nature-society dualism the heart of political ecology, which he replaced human actors with assemblages of actants. But once he belatedly felt the need to reconsider the actual planetary ecological emergency represented by the new Anthropocene epoch, capital C, epoch in geological history, Latour found himself devoid of all reference points, since the ecology had been thrown into question in his philosophy, and he reverted to mystifying concepts like Gaia and what he called the earthbound, a reworking and personification of the notion of the terrestrial. More importantly, given the nature of the planetary destruction, he was confronted with the question to how to conceive of this from the standpoint of a political order. Thus, he turned to Smith's The Nomos of the Earth and the International Law of the Just Publicum Europeanum, written in the Nazi Germany. It's one of many revitalizations of Smith we see in these post-Marxist. Smith's work sought to root in law in the earth, not in the sense of ecology, but in rather territorialization. Yeah, Valosity, you see this in Dubin too. Conceiving this as the basis of the permanent state of war that grounded international law. Lukács' evaluation of Smith of this period is naturally much harsher than that of Latour. The Nazi legal theorist Schmidt, Lukács argues, had quickly shifted the new imperial climate following the fall of the Third Reich. It did not matter to him, Carl Schmitt, whether it is Hitler, Eisenhower, or a newly arisen German imperialism that sets up the absolute dictatorship of monopoly capitalism. Still, basing his analysis on Schmitt, Latour tells us that the answer lies in a new state of war on behalf of the earthbound. He ends his 2015 Facing Gaia by praising the spirit of Christopher Columbus. Despite his criticisms of the modern, Latour allied himself, at least for a time, with the capitalist ultra-eco-modernist of the Breakthrough Institute, asking people to love your Frankenstein monsters. Irrationalism is now thoroughly in fashion again. A further radicalization of the impossibility of an exit is evident as the world in late imperialism faces two forms of exterminism: nuclear war and planetary ecological emergency. Those are both real threats. In a conference and book addressing the anti-Semitism and Nazism in Heidegger's Black Notebook, representing a desperate effort to salvage Heidegger's philosophy in some way, despite the revelations that Nazism was integral to his entire outlook, it was a Lacanian Hegelian philosopher. We should just say Lacanian, and then in parentheses Hegelian, because Zizek's Hegel is Lacan as much as it is Hegel. Was given to the final word, no doubt due to his reputation as a leftist thinker. Zizek sought to defend the importance of Heidegger for philosophy despite his Nazism on the grounds of the significance of his fundamental ontology of the ontological difference, or the relation of beings to being, out of which Heidegger's analysis of Dasein and his deconstruction of the conscious ego had arisen. This then is seen as separable from the specifics of Heidegger's political path. But even if he did not move away from his far right views, failing to repudiate his Nazi past, Heidegger, we are told, is still commended for the fundamental ontology of his being in time in his criticism of the scientific technological civilization, viewed as distinguishable from his complicity with the Third Reich. In Zizek's work, Less Than Nothing, Hegel and the Shadow of Dialectical Materialism, my least favorite Zizek work, Heidegger is praised even more strongly. Not only is Heidegger presented here as a figure operating against the grain within a practice that is strangely close to communism, cough, oh my God, but also we are told that Heidegger of the mid-30s when he was a member of the Nazi Party, can be seen as a future communist, even if he never arrived at the destination. Heidegger's Nazism, Zizek apologetically declares, was not a simple mistake, but rather a right step in the wrong direction. Thus, Heidegger cannot be simply dismissed as a German folkish reaction. In the Nazi period, Heidegger, Zizek postulates, was opening up possibilities which point towards a radical emancipatory politics. To be sure, this was written before the publication of the Black Notebooks, although well after many of Heidegger's Nazi writings had appeared. But as we have seen, the Black Notebooks with their virulent anti-Semitism did little to alter Zizek's overall defense of Heidegger's philosophy. No, and this Zizek reads a lot like Dubin. Zizek's loyalty to Heidegger's anti-humanist project is evident in his current post-humanist stance, in which he argues, while commending Binet, that nature and ecology, along with its humanity, are no longer meaningful categories. Even the indigenous defense of the earth is, in this perspective, to be belittled. In an article focused on the discussion of Marx's concept of the metabolic rift, and John Bellamy Foster would really like to go after Zizek for this, Zizek responded to the socialist and indigenous Bolivarian President Evo Morales' call for a defense of Mother Earth with the quip that to this one is tempted to add that if there is one good thing about capitalism, it is under it, Mother Earth no longer exists. What was meant by this, as in much of Zizek's writing, was not immediately clear, but it fits with his other statements, reflecting a similar disdain for ecological problems and an indirect apologetics for the system, such as his declaration that ecology is the new opium of the masses. Indeed, both denaturalization of nature and the dehumanization of humanity are built into Zizek's general anti-humanist outlook, which conforms to the principle of the radicalization of the impossibility of exit. Thus, he declares in a nihilistic way, the power of human culture has not only built an autonomous symbolic universe beyond which we experience as nature, to produce new unnatural and natural objects within materialized human knowledge, we not only symbolize nature, we also, as it were, denaturalize it from within. The only way to confront ecological challenges is to accept the fully radical denaturalization of nature. But this also implies the radical dehumanization of humanity, since, as he also states, there are human beings only insofar as there is an impenetrable inhuman nature, Heidegger's earth. The problem for all discussions of humanity's embeddedness in nature and the analysis of the metabolic rift, he claims, is that they tend to regress to the dialectical materialist general ontology, referring to the dialectical naturalism of Engels and Lenin. Boo, Zizek. In accordance with Zizek's own idiosyncratic idealist and irrationalist approach to the dialectical materialism, I mean, I actually don't disagree with those statements, but I do think you have to, like, point them out more than you have. Anyway, and this is already a long article. I guess I'm saying this should have been a book. Like John Bellamy Foster, I know he doesn't have time, is not always in the greatest of health, but maybe he should write a book on, the continued destruction of reason, which he purports to return Marx to Hegel and enact a materialist reversal on Marx himself via pure idealism. Both naturalism equals materialism and critical humanism must be rejected, in conformity with left Heideggerianism. Material reality thus gives way to the abstract real. Yeah, we see this in most Heideggerian thought. I don't hate Heideggerian thought, despite what people think, but I do think there is an irrationalist core in some of the ways its concepts are used. I don't disagree with Alain Sokol on that. Anyway, such views lead to a withdrawal from any meaningful praxis, a deep pessimism, and a dialectic of irrationalism. Without ever seriously addressing the global ecological crisis as a class-based struggle against capitalism necessary to avoid crossing the planetary tipping point, Zizek blithely declares, we must assume catastrophe as our destiny. Such irrationalism in relation to the environmental crisis of capitalism is also evident in Zizek's response to the current growing threat of nuclear conflict between NATO and Russia in the context of the Ukraine war. Indeed, we see a further destruction of reason, the product of a confused anti-humanism mixed with nationalistic fervor. This is evident in Zizek's insistence that NATO should continue to support the war in Ukraine and walk away from peace talks, despite the growing dangers of a global thermonuclear exchange, which would almost certainly annihilate all of humanity, well, maybe not all of it, but most of it, simply in order to save face. Others, like Noam Chomsky, who has raised the issue of a relation of the growing global exterminationist threat, are wrongly dismissed by Zizek as supporters of Putin's Russia. That's something else. Yeah, I mean, like, I tend to side with Chomsky on this, and I'm also, some of the Russianists find me not sufficiently supportive of Putin's Russia, but what happened in Ukraine should have never happened, and I don't just mean in the invasion of the country by Russia. I also mean all the context that made that a more likely scenario. You can't deal with one without addressing the others. We are told that the same logic as the governing of Russia's insistence that Ukraine not be brought into NATO and that nuclear weapons not be stationed on Ukrainian soil would be present. An existential crisis to the Russian state dictates that Ukraine, too, should have arms supplied, in this case by the West, and even nuclear weapons to achieve military parity with Russia. Here we see Hartmann's cosmic suicide as a supreme manifestation of the intellect and will suddenly reemerging in our time. Once again, the irrationalism cultivated at the highest intellectual levels that dominated the outlooks of the rest at the beginning of the First World War is choking off all rational alternatives. To offer uncritical support of the goals of the imperial triad of United States, Canada, Europe, and Japan, or to support global NATO in the late imperialist context, is to identify with the irrational will to power at the imperial center of the world economy, leading either to the eternal return of exploitation, expropriation, or Hartmann's cosmic suicide. Today, reason demands that both exploitation and expropriation and the related exterminist tensions of our time be overcome. This can be accomplished, as Baran noted in the 1960s, on the basis of the identity of the material interest of class or class-based social forces with reason's criticism of existing irrationality. The source of such identity of material interest within the class currently lies in the global South, and with those revolutionary-style movements everywhere seeking to return the entire capital colonialist imperialist system for the sake of humanity and the earth. Which I don't entirely disagree with, but I don't think it's that it only lies in the global south. The global south has to have something to connect up with, without which this will get pretty nasty, because it's asking the poorest amongst to not side with those who should have solidarity with them. And in that challenge, I actually do think that, even though I disagree with the whole framework of Western Marxism as somehow about this, that internationalism in a real sense needs to be revitalized on the left. And the dealing with, and I tend to take Otto Bauer's answer to this question, and it's not dealt with here at all, but dealing with the national, with wrongs of various ethnic groups, aka nations, in the 19th century sense, not the nation state sense of which is used in the 20th century, of which China, Russia, and the United States or India aren't singular nations in the ethnic sense anyway. And if they are only by imposition from the state. They don't exist organically, so to speak, as in 19th century nationalism, which didn't really exist organically either. It's part of the dominance of national rationalization that leads us to ignore how genocidal even that was. Nonetheless, it is the world in which we live. And that is not to justify it. But a truly internationalist orientation has to be there, and it has to be beyond the lines of imperial domination, either in the United States or, frankly, and this I might identify with other people, I think pretending, for example, that all anti-imperialist powers are somehow anti-communist, or somehow communist or anti-communist, is just kind of explicitly wrong. But that does not mean that we should somehow hope that the domination of the world through the West, and somehow a Western socialist revolution in the core, which no one can seem to articulate, be how we spread this. That's a gambit some socialists actually do make, and one that I think we should be wary of. I have a lot more to say about this. I think this is a challenging article. I agree with like 70% of it, but 30% of it I find to be too flattening. I know that people are like, oh, you're contesting this and you're trying to make it overly complicated, nuanced, so that we can't see. No, I'm trying to get you to see clearly certain things in history that conflated things. You cannot ignore the Sino-Soviet split and why the Soviet Union fell. Even if you think that China was justified in parts of its actions, you have to deal with who it sided with in the Vietnam War, for example, in Cambodia versus Vietnam, where it sided with the United States, in foregrounds where it sided with Pinochet. Right? You cannot erase that from the history to come with a grand heroic narrative where there wasn't contradictions in the socialist movement and the Marxist-Leninist world itself. All of that as just a problem of Western Marxism. That is a way to avoid the hard question of why it historically happened. All right? That's an easy answer for people. And it isn't totally false. All right? There was a naivete about liberalism in Western Marxism. But basically, it's a selective invention to flatten things out and also ignore the problems within the socialist world itself. The Sino-Soviet split proved that the socialist world was not all that unified. And Marxists were killing each other in the 70s. You cannot erase that history. All right? Part of how we got to this period of unreason is that history. It must be fully embraced as it is true and cannot be flattened in historiographic categories. But otherwise, I agree with this. I think the abandonment of Lukács in this book and just throwing this off as a Stalinist book is profoundly unfair to this, even if it was Stalinist, which I don't think it is, right? Even if it was a product of the utmost Soviet orthodoxy, we should take it seriously. Even if I have problems with Soviet Marxism, and I often do, it was way too mechanistic. This period of Lukács is not that, but it is pointing out that you couldn't do total equivalency between the Soviet world and the Western world, despite whatever barbarism happened in the 30s. And despite the problems of the Sino-Soviet split, which Lukács only lived to see a little of. We cannot erase that out of our history, but we also cannot erase Lukács out of our history. This simple bracketing things out so that we don't have to deal with what good happened in the Soviet Union or what bad happened in the Soviet Union leaves us in a place where we can't really understand how we got here. And I think what John Bellamy Foster is arguing for is closer to the truth. But even it brackets stuff out that are inconvenient, and we need to stop it. That's all. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. I cover more behind the Patreon wall. You can get a Patreon subscription for as little as $3. Have a nice day.